colonists were very much of actual theft and robbery and murder, and some colonists even went as far as what we would now regard as being the Eastern Cape. And they basically attacked Khoi groups and stole their cattle and massacred.
It was indeed not a free exchange. And part of that trade was accompanied by violence.
Once the colonists began to expand further into the interior and their farms became more widespread and they needed to defend and protect the cattle that they'd stolen, you needed a force to protect the colonists.
Dutch used a system that we now know, known as the commando system, in order to coerce Khoi people who were still trying to hold on to land in their independent tribal forms to get rid of that land or to transfer that land to Dutch, into Dutch ownership.
It had tragic consequences for us and our forebears, as well as the present generation in South Africa. That peace treaty, finally, they lost not only their land, but also the independence.
The Dutch East India Company commander Jan van Riebeck first heard of a rich and powerful tribe that lived just over the mountain. The company was under pressure to find more meat and were looking for other tribes to trade with. In the company journal, it is written, "A much bigger nation with a greater wealth of stock. Like the rest of the Khoi tribes, the Hessequas were transhuman and there were no real boundaries. Roughly, they grazed their herds all along the Sonderend River and in Swellendam, all along the Breda River and as far east as the Khouritz River. They had a good relationship with their neighbors, the Khoriquas on the east side and the Khainuquas on the western border. And the groups often strayed into each other's territory."
Early accounts by travelers and traders will find evidence of the presence of the Khoi in the names of rivers and places. This is the Hessequa's river, and behind me is the Hessequa's kloof. The Hessequas lived in this region, some 2 kilometers west of Swellendam. This is Mossel Bay Beach on the South Cape coast. It is Khoriqua territory, not Hessequa, but we start our journey on the Hessequa here because of its historical significance. To answer some of my questions, I'm going to meet with Professor Michael de Jong, who has done extensive research on the Hessequa and written this book, A Forgotten First People, the Southern Cape Hessequa. Professor de Jong, before we start speaking about the Hessequa, can you tell me a little bit about the first contact between the Khoi and the Europeans that apparently happened in this area?
Yes, this was a particularly significant contact because Bartholomew Diaz came to the shore and stepped ashore, and he saw people here with cattle who had been grazing just above us here, and they entertained him and welcomed them in a very friendly manner. This was in 1488. Because the Khouritz River is so close to here, we deduce that they were the Khoriqua. Now, Khoriqua or Khoriqua actually means people of the cattle. And they did have cattle. In fact, the early Dutch people called this Khouritz River, which is close to us, the Rio dos Vaqueiros, which means the river of the cattle people.
And people speak about a skirmish here. Was that skirmish between the Khoriqua and the Portuguese?
When Diaz landed here, it was a friendly meeting. In fact, they danced and sang a song and said, "Welcome to us." And they had good relations. But upon returning at the later stage, I think these people who arrived here presumed they can take water, they can help themselves to cattle. I think that might have been the origin.
According to the ship's records, Diaz shot and killed one of the Khoi with his crossbow.
Diaz became the first murderer of a herder at that time. That was when Bartholomew Diaz arrived at Mossel Bay.
The cattle post at Reed Fillet, just outside Swellendam, became an important trading stop. Klaas Dora's name first appears in VOC records when he introduced the Klaas became one of the leaders. His kraal was here, not far from Grabo, and for 20 years he was the important middleman in their trade with the Hessequas. In 1693, things changed, and the governor Simon van der Stel suspected Klaas Dora of working against them. They attacked his kraal, arrested him, and confiscated all his livestock.
Klaas, or Captain Dora, was a man who tried his hardest, I suppose, to cooperate or collaborate with the company. The futility of trying to form alliances with the company, that eventually the company turned on him, stripped him of his wealth, stripped him of his power, and he finished his life in poverty.
Although the company leadership, the Here 17, condemned Governor van der Stel's actions, the damage had been done.
His life is an illustration of, I suppose, that one of the options available to the Khoi was collaboration rather than resistance, and his life story really shows the futility of collaboration.
But later, trading expeditions by settlers often deteriorated into cattle raids. One of the most callous attacks happened in the Eastern Cape.
They did horrific things to the Khoi and San clans, owners of livestock, to the extent that Simon van der Stel put a ban on the trade in livestock between the Khoi and the Freeburgers.
This area was called Bakleiplatz, or site of fighting, because of skirmishes between the Dutch and the Khoi. By 1769, the once wealthy Hessequas that traded with the Dutch here possessed hardly any livestock.
The Landrost of Stellenbosch reports that the Khoi society is already in disarray and disintegrating in the southwestern Cape before even the smallpox epidemic, and he attributes this largely to incursions by violent colonists. He mentions one character in particular he calls Dronke Gerrit, and I think the name says it all. Dronke Gerrit was a man who turned to violence to basically rob the Khoi of their livestock, and one can imagine that he wasn't alone. He probably had huntlangers, and they had muskets, and were a pretty formidable force.
There was a huge increase in the demand for meat and produce. So they had to also acquire large amounts of cattle from the last remaining independent Khoi tribes. The commando system was used effectively to coerce these tribes to trade with the Dutch.
Once the Khoi lost their cattle, they had very few options except to either become laborers for the new class of company settler, who was finding it was much easier to be a cattle farmer or a sheep farmer than it was to be an agriculturalist.
The few remaining Hessequa kraals were under constant threat from land-hungry farmers moving in from the Cape. Professor Russell Viljoen did extensive research into a case of land dispossession in 1787. A farmer named